why Thomas Muir would have believed in it too. Now I want to turn to the 2014 referendum. I'll just have a little drink. A lot has been written about what happened in the referendum campaign of 2012-2014. I just want to take a minute to recap, because for me, it was without doubt the most remarkable political campaign that I've ever been involved in, and I've been involved in a few. It was a campaign that reached people literally that other campaigns have never reached. It achieved a level of motivation, a level of discussion, a level of action that has never been seen before. It was a very positive campaign. We conducted that campaign always accentuating the positive, always regarding problems as something that could be overcome and trying to find solutions to them, not regarding them as barriers. Always saying we didn't have opponents, we only had people we had yet to convince. But most particularly, we created a political alliance during that campaign of people who believed in independence as a matter of principle, together with people who believed in independence as a way of changing the world. And that political amalgam was a tremendous coming together, a fusion, if you like, of the two radical traditions of Scotland, the campaign for national economy and the campaign for social justice, which is a much more contemporary one. But they fused together in that 2012 to 2014 referendum campaign and became almost a new political hybrid, because when people asked, should Scotland be an independent country, it provoked many other questions. People said, well, what sort of country? For whose benefit? Who wins? Who loses? What would it look like? And invariably, people found themselves answering back, well, we want a Scotland that is different from the one in which we live today, one that is fairer, more tolerant, more equal, more outward-looking than the country in which we're living today. And so those people who long aspired for social and economic change came to view independence as a means to get it. And that is why people's imagination caught fire in 2013 and 2014. That is why 1 million conversations all over this land created the situation they did, where 45% of our fellow countrymen and women voted to secede from the fifth most powerful country on the planet. And it didn't start out that way. What happened, because the 45%, what happened is that rose from 25% at the beginning of the campaign. Put it another way, 750,000 people voted for independence in September 2014 who did not agree with it when the campaign started. And that is a remarkable turnaround and a remarkable vindication of political activity. But we didn't win. And I think we have spent the 3 years since trying to understand what we do next. Because, as Jamie also alluded to, you might think that if you didn't win a campaign like that, after having put so much effort into it, it would be like bursting a balloon, that it would just dissipate and go away. But in fact, the losing of the referendum seemed to be a fillip, seemed to be a boost to people who wanted radical change, and the momentum seemed to carry on into 2015. Now, I know there will be people who will be concerned that what has happened this year in 2017 is somehow a reversal of what that momentum was, and they will be anxiously wondering, what do we do next? So I want to spend the next few minutes looking at what happened in this year's general election. Now, at 10 o'clock on the 8th of June, I just arrived at the Meadowbank Sports Centre where they were counting the votes for the Edinburgh constituencies. And it was just as the exit poll came out on the BBC, which predicted that, contrary to all expectations, Theresa May's Conservative government had just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. And that, in fact, what started as a majority Conservative government was no longer. We were looking at a hung parliament in the UK, and that the SNP was looking at losing a third or more of its seats in Scotland. And that was the exit poll, and nobody believed it at 10 o'clock. And I spent the next 90 minutes doing TV and radio interviews explaining how, if the poll were true, this would be a major defeat for the Tories, and in fact, it would be a major victory for the SNP because we had won in Scotland as the Tories had lost in the UK. Both of us knowing the interviewee and the interviewer that the exit poll probably was rubbish, but we had time to fill before the real results came in. But as it turned out, contrary to expectations, the exit poll was remarkably accurate. And as first results came in and the second wave came in, it began to look like this was indeed what was going to happen. And the situation in Scotland was, certainly on the one hand, that the SNP did win 36 seats. It won a majority, 60% of all of the seats that it contested, the only party in the UK to win a majority of seats that it contested. It also won 37% of the vote, more than any other party, and it won more votes than any other party. So, what's to worry about? Of course, it was a victory. It was, in truth, the second best ever Westminster election campaign for the SNP, and had it not been for the electoral tsunami of 2015, people would have said this is a truly remarkable result. But it didn't feel like that to me, and I doubt it felt like that to many of the people who might support the things that I believe in this hall, because there's another way of looking at it, and that is that in the space of just 2 years, the SNP's vote came down from 49% to 37%, a massive loss of votes in a very short period of time. In fact, 480,000 people who had voted for the SNP in 2015 declined to do so in 2017. More worryingly, in 2015, the SNP had more than 50% of the votes in 35 constituencies in Scotland. Today, it has 50% of the votes in not one constituency in Scotland. And many of the seats that it does hold can truly be regarded as marginal. So if anybody thinks this is anything other than a major wake-up call for the SNP or indeed anyone in the wider independence movement, then they need to go and think again, because a wake-up call it is. And we need to understand what happened that led to those results. Now, in the one hand, the research shows that the biggest group of those 480,000 people simply stayed at home. They didn't vote for anyone, about 70% of them, according to the surveys. But amongst the rest, there were changes in political allegiance. And I want to look at 4 reasons why they happened. The first was the Conservative campaign to do with the second independence referendum. Now, let's be clear, the objective of that campaign was not to persuade people who support independence to stop supporting it and vote Tory. It wasn't that at all. The objective of the campaign was to position the Conservative Party as the political leadership of the unionist majority in Scotland. It was to try and galvanise support within people who already believed in the union. For that reason, they changed the name and started calling themselves the Scottish Unionist Party. They tried this faux separation from their London leadership, and they talked incessantly about nothing else than the union and the second independence referendum. Even when people like me weren't talking about it, you could be sure that Ruth Davidson would be. So what they were trying to do in that was to level a very clear accusation. The Conservative accusation was that we were the anti-democrats. We were the ones who did not respect the view of the Scottish people because they had voted just in 2014 to remain part of the union, and we were ignoring that, disrespecting it, and they, the Conservative Party, they were the voice of the people. They were the new friends of the people. That was what they were trying to say. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that. We know that the vote happened in 2014. We know that we lost. I think most people will accept that we lost. But the argument was that if circumstances were to change to such an extent that they invalidated the options that were presented to people in 2014, then it would be legitimate to have that vote again. In much the same way, if you get back from the shop and you find, when you open the box, that the thing inside is not what was described on the outside, you've got the right to go and get your money back or get the thing changed. People would have a right to get their vote back if the terms of 2014 were changed by the people who had won. That was the argument. And in fact, that wasn't just a theoretical argument. In the Scottish National Party manifesto for the Scottish general election of May 2016, this was written down and exemplified. And it said, If, for example, Scotland is taken out of the European Union against its will, then that might occasion the need for a second referendum because people had voted in 2014 to stay in the UK, partly because they believed that was a way of staying in the European Union. That was the argument. Now, even I have to admit, that's a pretty complex and nuanced argument. And it's not really that good of a confrontation against somebody simply saying, you've had your referendum, why do you need another one? So we got drawn in to a discussion not about the benefits of independence, but about the technicalities of the vote. We got drawn into talking about process rather than principle, which is exactly what the Conservatives wanted, because all of their polling showed that actually there were more people concerned about an independence referendum than were concerned about independence. And that's why you never heard the Tories slag off independence. They never said, oh, we're against it, it was a bad idea. They talked always about the second Indy referendum. And they did a second thing, which was a second factor in the election campaign. They tried to abstract the notion of a referendum and make it a dry constitutional academic debate and then juxtapose it with what they would regard as the real business of government, the day job, as if people who argued for independence somehow were incapable, therefore, because of that, of running schools, hospitals, police services, or whatever. And we gave ground in that, and we never, ever should. Because Thomas Muir knew that in order to advance political reform, you had to root the political and constitutional changes you were arguing for in the material condition of the people that were affected by them. So you had to argue that the reason why we wanted political reform was to make life better for people. The two things should never be divorced. And I believe that one of the things that we need to do is that we need to get back to a situation of arguing, yes, about the achievements of the devolved Scottish Government, and they are legion, but always pointing out that those things have been achieved in a situation where the Scottish Government essentially operates within financial and legislative constraints which are not of its making, and it has, in real terms, got one hand tied behind its back. So as well as offering up something to praise or to be proud about in terms of a government achievement, I think we also need to say, and if we had the powers of an independent country, this is what we could do in addition to that. You need to show people how we can go further. The question of the second independence referendum, of course, was in itself taken out of our hands by the election on June the 8th, because the reason, the whole connection with the debate on Brexit was about how we might activate that mandate that we got in 2016, which said we could have a second referendum in second terms, uncertain terms. And of course, at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2017, well, actually, before I get to that, it's worth noting that as soon as Brexit happened, as soon as that vote happened, and it played out almost exactly as the scenario was envisaged in the manifesto, as soon as you had a situation where people in Scotland voted by 62% to remain in the EU, but people in the rest of the UK voted to leave, then you had a situation where what was described in the manifesto was actually coming to pass. And you had the opportunity to activate that, albeit conditional mandate that had been received. But it's interesting to note that the reaction of the Scottish Government wasn't to say, right, we're running for a second referendum now because of this. Actually, they tried to square the circle. They tried to respect both the decision of 2014 in the Scottish referendum and 2016 in the Brexit referendum. And they came up with a series of quite detailed proposals which were published in December last year, called Scotland's a framework document for Scotland's place in Europe, which suggested a way in which Scotland could have a different relationship with the European Union than the rest of the United Kingdom, while still remaining part of the United Kingdom. Now, this was produced by an SNP government that believes in independence and believes in the European Union, and it advocated neither of those things. It was truly a remarkable act of compromise. And what happened next was the reaction to that from the British government, which was at best dismissive and disrespectful, and basically they refused to negotiate on that document. So I think, to be honest, by the time we get to March of this year, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon had any option left but to say, well,